This is Overheard Nation, where America's forgotten secrets come to light. Ready to uncover the truth?
After the Great War, the American plains seemed like a land of infinite promise. A vast, quiet expanse in the heart of the country became the stage for a new kind of gold rush. The government offered land for next to nothing, luring settlers with the dream of self-sufficiency. A powerful and seductive slogan echoed across the region: "Rain follows the plow." It was a theory born of pure optimism, a belief that the very act of cultivating the land would change the climate itself, summoning moisture from the sky. This idea became an article of faith for a generation eager to believe in its own power to tame the wilderness. Driven by this conviction, a wave of humanity descended upon the plains. Millions of acres of ancient prairie, a sea of native buffalo grass, whose deep roots had held the topsoil for centuries, were mercilessly overturned. The silence of the plains was broken by the roar of new machines. Fordson tractors worked day and night, their headlights cutting through the darkness as they pulled massive disc plows that sliced through the earth. They were brutally efficient, turning the green and gold prairie into endless, neat furrows of black, exposed soil. For a time, the gamble seemed to pay off. The 1920s brought wet years and record wheat prices, driven by the need to feed a recovering Europe. It was an era of unprecedented prosperity. Farmers who had arrived with nothing became wealthy almost overnight. They bought new cars, built modern homes with electricity, and spent their money with the confidence of men who had conquered nature. They called themselves wheat kings and suitcase farmers, a new aristocracy of agriculture. It felt as though the golden age would never end.
In their quest for profit, they waged a total war against the ecosystem that had sustained the plains for millennia. They saw the native landscape not as a complex, balanced system, but as an obstacle to be cleared. The last great herds of bison, whose hooves had naturally aerated and compacted the soil, were gone. Farmers finished the job by eradicating millions of prairie dogs, viewing them as pests, ignorant of the fact that their burrows had created a vital network for channeling scarce water deep into the earth. With every acre they plowed, they stripped the land of its protective skin, the tough, living sod that held it together. The ground was left naked, defenseless, and vulnerable to the wind that always swept across the flat terrain. No one heeded the warning signs. The old native peoples, who understood the delicate balance of the land, watched the black furrows multiply and shook their heads. But their wisdom was ignored. The fever for wheat blinded everyone to the truth. In their ambition, they had taken a stable ecosystem and transformed it into a fragile, artificial one. They had set the stage for a catastrophe of their own making, planting a time bomb in the heart of their country. The mechanism was armed, and the clock was already ticking.
In 1931, the rains stopped. At first, it was treated as a temporary setback, a familiar hardship of life on the plains that required patience and resolve. But the seasons turned, and the sky remained a relentless, empty blue. The optimism of the previous decade began to dry up along with the land. Year after year, the sun beat down with a punishing intensity, baking the endless fields of wheat until they withered and died. The vibrant greens and golds of the boom years faded to a uniform, brittle brown. Rivers that had once flowed with purpose slowed to a trickle, then vanished, leaving behind cracked, serpentine beds of dried mud. The earth itself began to change. The rich topsoil, once dark and moist, was cooked by the ceaseless heat. It hardened and fractured, the ground breaking apart into a vast, intricate mosaic of fissures. Then the wind began its work. The same prairie wind that had always been there now had nothing to hold it back. The pulverized soil, stripped of its anchoring grass, was lifted into the air. The first signs were small, almost playful dust devils that spun across the barren fields. They were unsettling omens, hints of a power that was being unleashed. Soon, the small whirlwinds grew into something more menacing. The storms became larger, more organized, carrying the topsoil for hundreds of miles. The color of the sky began to shift. The familiar blue was replaced by a sickly, jaundiced yellow, which deepened to a hazy brown. On the worst days, the sky turned a coppery red, and the sun was reduced to a pale, impotent disk hanging in the gloom. The very air felt heavy, thick with the soil of distant farms. The dust became an invasive, inescapable presence. It worked its way through every defense, seeping through the smallest cracks in walls and window frames. Housewives stuffed wet rags and newspapers into every crevice, but it was a futile battle. Each morning began with the same ritual, sweeping and shoveling layers of fine, gritty dust from floors, tables, and beds. It coated everything with a uniform layer of filth. It got into their food, giving every meal a gritty texture. It clouded their drinking water. The metallic taste of it was always in their mouths. The human body began to break down under the constant assault. A dry, hacking cough became a constant companion for everyone, a sound that echoed through the quiet farmhouses. For children and the elderly, it was especially dangerous. Doctors began to see a new, terrifying sickness they called dust pneumonia. The fine, silica-laden dust filled the lungs, causing inflammation and infection. There was no medicine, no cure. The air that was meant to give life had become a poison. People looked to the sky, to the land, and to each other, and a cold realization began to dawn. This was not simply a drought. This was something new, a catastrophe they had helped create, and it was far from over. April 14, 1935, began with a deceptive tranquility. The morning was bright and clear, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. For the first time in a long while, the air was still. Families emerged from their homes, blinking in the sunlight, feeling a fragile sense of hope. It was a perfect spring day, a brief respite that felt like a promise of rain, a hint that the years of hardship might finally ending. People went to church, visited neighbors, and allowed themselves a small measure of peace. The illusion was shattered in the afternoon.
A darkness began to gather on the northwestern horizon. It was not the familiar shape of a rain cloud, but a solid, menacing line that grew with unnatural speed. Those who saw it watched in silent horror as it resolved into a colossal wall of roiling black and brown dust, a moving mountain that stretched from the ground to a height of several miles. It moved faster than a galloping horse, consuming the landscape before it. Birds, sensing the approaching doom, shrieked in terror and fell from the sky. The temperature dropped dramatically as the monstrous cloud blocked out the sun. When the wall of dust hit, it did not arrive like a normal storm. It descended like a biblical plague. The bright afternoon was extinguished in an instant, plunged into a darkness more profound than any midnight. It was an absolute, suffocating blackness that rendered sight useless. Inside homes, families huddled together, listening to the deafening roar of the wind, a sound like a freight train that would not pass. A strange and terrifying phenomenon occurred as the storm raged. The air became thick with static electricity. Blue sparks danced along barbed wire fences. People who touched each other felt a sharp, painful jolt. Radios fell silent, and car engines stalled on the roads as the electrical charge shorted them out. Anyone caught outside was thrown into a state of primal fear. They were lost in a world without light or landmarks, unable to see their own hands in front of their faces. The air became a thick, gritty substance, almost impossible to breathe. Each gasp was a struggle, filling the lungs with fine, choking dust that tasted of soil and despair. It felt like being buried alive while standing up. For many, the only way to find shelter was to crawl on their hands and knees, hoping to stumble upon a familiar fence post or wall. This was not just another dust storm. It was an event that felt like the end of the world. It was the single most terrifying and destructive storm of the Dust Bowl, a day of apocalyptic darkness that would be seared into the collective memory of all who survived it. It broke the will of even the most resilient people. In the aftermath, as the dust slowly settled, it left behind a changed landscape and a changed population. The last vestiges of hope were scoured away, replaced by a single, stark realization. This land was no longer habitable. It was time to run. The decision to leave was the final act of surrender. It was a quiet, heartbreaking admission that the land they had fought for, bled for, and loved had finally won. There was nothing left to salvage. Hope had been scoured away by the relentless wind, leaving only the grim necessity of survival. The exodus began not as a single event, but as a slow, steady drain of humanity from the heart of the nation. Families were forced to liquidate their lives. Everything that could not be strapped to a car was sold for pennies on the dollar. Farm equipment that had once been a symbol of pride, household furniture that had been passed down through generations, and the last of the livestock were all sacrificed for a handful of cash to fund the journey west. The process was a brutal lesson in what was truly essential. A lifetime of possessions was reduced to what could fit in a single, overloaded vehicle. These vehicles became modern-day arks, dilapidated and barely roadworthy. Old Ford Model Ts and rickety farm trucks were piled high with mattresses, cooking pots, tools, crates of chickens, and the family members themselves clinging to any available space. Each car was an island of desperation, a self-contained world carrying the last remnants of a shattered life. They became refugees in their own country, pilgrims on a desperate quest. Their path was the legendary Route 66, a ribbon of asphalt that stretched towards the setting sun. The highway transformed into a slow-moving river of migration. Hundreds of thousands of cars, forming a crawling, sputtering convoy of misery, headed west. This was not a journey of adventure, but a funeral procession for a way of life. They traveled through a landscape that was as broken as they were, passing abandoned farmhouses and fields buried in sand. The journey itself was a grueling ordeal. The overloaded engines of their old cars overheated in the desert sun. Tires, worn thin, blew out constantly. A simple breakdown could be catastrophic, leaving a family stranded for days with dwindling supplies. Food and water were rationed with painful care. Hunger was a constant, gnawing presence. Sickness spread easily among the weakened travelers. For many, the journey ended on the roadside. The quiet, desperate act of burying a child or an elder in a shallow, unmarked grave became a tragic and all too common ritual. There was no time to mourn. The family had to move on before they met the same fate. Yet they were propelled forward by a powerful myth. Handbills and rumors promising abundant work in the fields and orchards of California were passed from car to car like scripture. California was not just a place, it was an idea, a sun-drenched paradise where the ground was fertile and life could begin anew. This hope, however fragile, was the fuel that kept them going through the hunger and the heartache. They did not know that the paradise they envisioned was an illusion, and that they were not driving towards salvation, but towards a new and different circle of hell. As the exhausted caravans of migrants crossed the border into California, the dream that had sustained them across 1,000 miles of hardship met its brutal end. There were no welcoming committees, no fields of opportunity waiting with open arms. Instead, they were greeted by police cordons and signs that read, "No jobs in California, keep out." The Promised Land was a fortress, and they were the unwelcome invaders. Locals watched their dusty, overloaded cars pass with a mixture of fear and contempt. These were not seen as fellow Americans in need of aid, but as a dirty, ignorant horde that had come to steal jobs and strain resources. A single derogatory word was used to strip them of their identity: Okie. It did not matter if they came from Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas, or Arkansas. The label branded them all as a single, undesirable entity. It was a word that carried the weight of scorn, a simple way to dismiss them as subhuman, as something other. This dehumanization made it easy for others to justify their cruelty and indifference. The migrants, who had once been proud farmers and landowners, were now reduced to a single insulting noun. The dream of work turned into the reality of systemic exploitation. The handbills that promised high wages were a deliberate lie, designed to create a massive surplus of labor. Each morning, hundreds of desperate men would line up for a handful of available jobs, a humiliating ritual that allowed landowners to drive wages down to starvation levels. They were paid by the bushel or the pound, and the grueling, back-breaking work of picking cotton, peaches, or grapes under the merciless California sun often yielded barely enough money to feed a family for a single day. Their living conditions were appalling. They settled in makeshift camps that sprouted like sores along irrigation ditches and at the edges of towns. These camps, often called Hoovervilles, were labyrinths of misery. Homes were constructed from whatever could be scavenged: cardboard, scrap metal, canvas, and old tires. There was no clean water, no sanitation. Sickness, like dysentery and typhoid, spread rapidly through the squalid communities. The camps were a landscape of profound poverty, where despair became a constant companion, a heavier burden than the dust they had left behind. The paradise they had envisioned was a lie. They had escaped a natural catastrophe, only to plunge into a social one, a disaster created not by the wind, but by the coldness of the human heart. While the migrants fought for their survival in California, a different kind of struggle began on the abandoned plains. The dust storms that blackened the sky had finally reached the nation's capital, dropping a fine layer of prairie soil on the desks of politicians in Washington, D.C. The catastrophe could no longer be ignored. The federal government, shocked into action, recognized that this was not a local problem, but a national ecological crisis. In response, a new war was declared, not against a foreign enemy, but against the destruction of the land itself. The Soil Conservation Service was formed, a federal agency tasked with the monumental challenge of healing a wounded continent. Under the leadership of scientists and experts, a massive and coordinated effort began. The Civilian Conservation Corps, an army of young men, was deployed across the plains to implement the ambitious Great Plains Shelter Belt project. They planted more than 200 million trees in long rows stretching from the Canadian border down to Texas. Each sapling was a soldier in this new war, a future barrier against the relentless wind. Simultaneously, a revolution in farming began. Agents from the government traveled from farm to farm, teaching the few remaining farmers a new gospel of conservation, a radical departure from the aggressive plowing of the past. They were taught to plow along the contours of the land instead of in straight lines, to build terraces on sloping fields, and to rotate their crops to replenish the soil's nutrients. It was a slow and difficult process of re-education, replacing a generation of hubris with a new philosophy of respect for the earth. Then, in the autumn of 1939, the rains finally returned. It was not a sudden, dramatic event, but a quiet, steady blessing that soaked into the recovering ground. The land, now partially anchored by the new trees and careful farming techniques, could finally drink the moisture instead of being washed away by it. The dust storms lessened in frequency and intensity, until one day they simply stopped. The sky over the plains was blue once more. Some families, hearing the news, made the long journey back home. They returned to a landscape that was profoundly and permanently scarred, yet slowly beginning to heal. Many more never came back, their roots now planted in the western states, their connection to the plains severed forever. The Dust Bowl was over, but it left an indelible mark not only on the land, but on the American psyche. It shattered the nation's founding myth of infinite resources and manifest destiny. It was a brutal, decade-long lesson on the fragility of nature's balance and the high price of human arrogance. The story became a timeless, cautionary tale, a permanent reminder that the earth is not a commodity to be exploited, but a living system that will, in the end, strike back.
The world is full of forgotten stories, and even more shocking secrets await you. Subscribe to Overheard Nation,